Hello, this is another narration of my process to create this, which is Venom, more of a Spider-Man Venom. It's probably a Peter Parker transformation with the symbiote. I was going for something that had quite a lot of texture in and very definitive Spider-Man type colour. This one was slightly different to some previous ones that I'd done in the fact that I decided to create this from some of my older drawings, some of my older paintings, and then play around with them and see what I could come up with. This is the initial painting I started off with, which I did probably about 3 years ago, and this was just something that came out of my head. And I thought I like the colours of it, I like the shape of the body, and I wanted to turn it into some kind of Venom type character by overlaying some of my art on to get the initial idea. If we play this one on a bit, just moving it around initially, focusing it centrally. And here comes some of my artwork. This is a shark that I did. I thought that might look quite good to overlay that on the head. And here I've got it on a separate layer and I'm just erasing away and then transforming the layer to move it around. And it's only very rough at the moment just to see what it looks like, because the light was coming from the right side as well, which always helps, and I quite like the look of it. And just turn the opacity down a bit. And again with this one, this was one of the first ones I ever did of a skull, which I think for eyes and the overall bone structure is always quite useful to put in. And again, I overlaid that on and I quite like the nice white colour of it. And here is a Venom, just the portrait that I did, which I had an idea of sticking on top of the torso. I thought that it might look quite good, and therefore I've decided to expand the canvas a little bit. I went into the menu and just expanded it out, and gives me a bit more headroom, no pun intended, and then move the head up into a reasonable position. It seems to fit fairly nicely. And then the underlying layers I can move around a bit just to add that skull-like aspect. Again, playing around, seeing what I can get, playing around with a couple of blend layers as well, blend modes, just to see what I can get out of this, and transforming things. It's a bit of playing around really to see what overall idea I can come up with, and then I can start painting over it. I like this idea. Now I've got quite a few paintings. I've got about 300 now. I like the idea of combining some of my older ones and then painting over into something new. And now I'm moderately happy with the idea. You can see I've merged down into a single layer. And now I'm just starting to tidy up the background by blurring the background a bit. It's something I'll address a bit later, but it's just to get things a bit more uniform. And just trying to merge the head in with the body, if I can now do that. Because as you can see, there's a bit of disparity with colour, and the lighting needs to be a bit more uniform. So I decided to use a colour layer here and make the colour more uniform, and that seems to have settled everything in quite nicely. And using the selection tool to separate the foreground from the background, which is always a useful thing to do for when I do the background a bit later on. Playing around with some colours here, doing a gradient fill and establishing some basic lighting. I want the lighting to come from the top left, as you can see, and the gradient fill is really useful for establishing general lighting, and it's got quite a decent lighting and quite a contrast related lighting, which is what I want for this as well. And there you could see I was playing around with some colours just to bind it all together. Again, this is still very rough. This is just coming up with the overall lighting scheme and the colour scheme. Now I've got the basic Venom character there in some kind of pose. I have a bit of an idea later on to make him a bit more dynamic. The pose is a bit stiff and a bit boring and a bit square and blocky. So I will sort that out later on. Here I'm applied a blend overlay layer, and now I'm erasing away just to bring out some of the lighting again. Again, this is just simple lighting effects that I'm trying to apply to establish the general picture. And thought, well, okay, let's go for something simple for the background at the moment. I've split it away from the foreground, but let's make it all black. And the idea is starting to emerge of Venom emerging from the gloom, from the dark, with just the light coming from the top left-hand corner. And therefore, I'm using the oil brush set to maximum stiffness, which is the way I like my oil brush. I feel as if I've got more control by doing that. And I'm starting to bind it all together now to establish the overall concept. I wasn't too happy with the colours. I thought they were a bit too saturated, and the colour layer is just dialing that down a bit more and giving it more of a monotone type of colour, which makes the saturated oranges and reds pop out a bit more. The overall idea is to have him looking more like Spider-Man than Venom normally would look, because this is a symbiote on Peter Parker. This is the overall plan for it. I'm now using the watercolour brush, which is something I don't often do, but I do really like the translucency and the kind of the lack of texture almost for an idea of the insignia, the spider insignia on the front. I thought this might work quite well because it will feel as if it's almost something stuck on, which is what I wanted it to reflect. The watercolour brush almost has a very slight outline to it, and it flows very nicely as well. And I thought I would just roughly sketch in the spider insignia, and then I can move it around and get it to fit nicely on his chest. And after that, I can then establish a bit of lighting on it to get it to fit in. As you can see, the lighting is just not right, but I'm not too bothered about that at the moment. I'm just transforming it, moving it around, rotating it, just getting it to fit on. ArtRage doesn't have a particularly complicated method of, it hasn't got any kind of mesh transform or anything, but that's okay. I'm not too bothered about that. I can move it as flexible a way as I possibly need to, and if I need to do a bit more, I can always use warp anyway to move it around a bit. I'm trying the lighting here over, I'm setting it to a paint only transparency, which means that everything I paint on this layer is only going to be within the bounds of the spider insignia. And I wanted to, it's not something I use too much, but I've got this on a separate layer, and I wanted just to overlay the lighting easily. And here you can see I have used the fill tool with a gradation, and it won't go outside the spider insignia, and therefore I can get it to fit in really nicely with not too much in the way of work. Just moving it into place now that all the lighting is pretty much set up, and I'm pretty happy with that. I think that's worked out quite nicely for a little idea I had on using the watercolour brush, because my paintings generally aren't using watercolour. It's usually the oil paint, and the watercolour I use for overlaying transparency effects, which works quite nicely. And as you can see there, I'm using my warp tool to bind it to the chest, which is quite useful because it does have a pinch and inflate option, and therefore to align it with the chest to inflate the basic image that I had worked quite nicely. Here I wasn't happy with the overall shape, as I mentioned earlier, of the whole body, and I wanted it to look a bit more like Spider-Man. I wanted it to look a bit more pointed and unique rather than more of a square head. I think the body I was quite happy with. As you can see there, I went for something a bit more extreme, which I do quite like to do with the pinch. If you really pinch and pinch and pinch, you can get some really interesting effects on. Or if you go the other way and inflate and inflate and inflate, you can get some really extreme results. I'm just going backwards and forwards and seeing whether I can get something that looks decent. I'm a bit happier with the shape now than it was before, but overall that's not exactly what I want. I want to make the shape a bit more like Spider-Man, which it isn't at the moment. Certainly the head shape isn't. But I'm deciding to add in a bit more detail now using the soft palette knife and set to kind of a medium pressure, a medium smudge, so you're not moving the paint too much around. And this is the way I like to establish some details and to get some nice flowing brush strokes to take place. There was a watercolour brush again to add a bit of transparency, because Venom kind of has this filmy symbiotic look to it. And here is the oil brush. I'm starting to lay some paint down and deciding to make the overall body look a lot darker. So I've chosen, as you can see on the colour palette there, a very dark colour, almost black. Initially to get the look of Venom, but later on I really do want to overlay some brighter reds on top to make him look more like Spider-Man. And this is just rendering out a little bit on my initial idea. Flipping, and I could see the problems with the shape of the head almost immediately, and therefore I decide to tweak it using the warp, and I like that a lot better now with the more pointed, thinner head. And now starting to get into some of the rendering. I want to preserve the lighting, I want to preserve the abs as much as possible, and again you can see there I just was pulling out the light again, overlaying a gradient fill and removing away. Just really wanted to go for something quite extreme of just emerging from the darkness with this, some really extreme lighting, and carrying on with some rendering. Decided this was the time to experiment a bit with the airbrush in Colour Dodge to see if I could bring out some reds, if I possibly could do, and see whether it looks any good or not. Experimenting with some blend modes here, and the difference blend mode was working quite well, if I remember correctly, with this colour, because it doesn't override everything. It leaves some things there, and I do like the difference and the exclusion blend tools at times, because you get some interesting effects, and that is just enabling the colours and the shape of the torso to come out a little bit more. And I'm happy with the way this is going now. The idea is definitely set in stone now, and deciding to try the background to see if anything will work, but I don't think at the moment anything really would, because the way the light's set up, it works really well of just seeing him emerging from a darkness. And therefore I've decided, I've gone to the soft palette knife again, and I'm just starting to render out a bit more. Flipping a couple of times to see how it's looking, and still not quite happy with those eyes. Just needed to fix them a bit and make him look a bit more menacing. Eyes are very difficult in Venom, I have realised, to get right, because they're a very strange shape, and getting them to sit right just took me quite a long time. But the warp tool is a really useful tool for doing things like that. Again, gone into a bit more rendering. I wasn't quite happy with the top of the head. I thought it was a bit too light for my liking, and what I'm doing here is I'm rendering it or trying to find a way to get the shape of the head in a bit more darkness, and therefore here you can see I'm playing around some blend modes of the paint that I just put in. And again, I think I rely on a difference blend mode actually look quite good once I tweaked it a little bit. I still think it's too light at the moment, but I will address that a bit later on. Just carrying on with some rendering. Changing the thinners, just increasing the thinners in the oil brush there, because I've kind of laid down most of the paint, and now I want to put more of a transparent effect over the top, which is what the thinners give. It just thins the paint down so you see a little bit of what comes in underneath. This is more just rendering, trying to get that light right on the top of the head. I still haven't quite got it yet. And also I want the eyes to come out a bit more, be a bit more pronounced, because that's where your eyes are going to be drawn to generally. Still wasn't happy with the shape of those eyes. and I wanted to build a bit more detail, as you can see with the soft palette knife, on the head, because the detail still isn't right with that at the moment. And this is just bringing out some more detail, carrying with the rendering. Just going backwards and forwards, just adding in a bit more light, because I think it needed to come out a bit more. And now popped it into GIMP and playing around with different colours. And I wanted to do something interesting. I wanted to, so this is a colour that I got and would look quite interesting. It's kind of a dark blue, desaturated blue, in contrast with kind of a purplish colour. Now that looked more like a traditional Venom, and I thought that maybe I could overlay possibly a high saturated colour dodge over the top when I imported it back into ArtRage. GIMP is a free tool and it's really useful to use to tweak the colours, as ArtRage doesn't really have anything like that. Here's just a simple colour, hue, contrast and lightness, but this does a fine job, and I don't really need Photoshop or anything like that when I have this. This does a really good job of just establishing some interesting colours that I normally wouldn't get. I don't mind just importing the image back into ArtRage. It works really well for me, and then carry on rendering it. Just playing around with different options in GIMP. I'm still learning it, and I'm still experimenting a lot with all the different colours. But there's nothing too extreme here. It's more of just getting the contrast to sit a bit better and getting some more interesting colours. And then I import the image onto a separate layer, and I may play around with the opacity a bit to just get it to sit in a bit more with my painting. And here I'm overlaying 2 layers, both with set to overlay, meaning that the brightness comes out a bit more, because I tend to make my art a bit too dark at times, and I wanted just to bring the contrast out a bit more using layer blend modes. That's what I'm doing here. But the idea is coming through quite well, and the contrast is looking quite good. And there we go, I just flipped it between what I had before. What I generally do is that I keep my older art in a separate layer, and then every now and again I'll pull in that older art and I'll just do a quick comparison to see that I'm actually getting somewhere with it. And also the older art sometimes on the layer I use and just blend it in with my new stuff. As you can see, this is what I'm doing here to get some extra effects, and because I may have just lost some of the lighting as I've started to render it. Now this is what I'm doing, just adding in some detail by using some of my former art and just blending it in slightly. All these little things gradually start to add up. Now back on some rendering and back to some warp as well. Again, I wasn't happy with those eyes. I just wanted to push them up a bit, and as you can see, that makes quite a big difference. And that may have been because I was just working in GIMP for a period of time. With some fresh eyes, I just came back in and saw that to get the more menacing Venom look, those eyes just needed to be pushed up a little bit. Just a bit of cropping there. Cropping is always an underrated tool to use. I didn't want him to sit right in the middle. I wanted him to be off to the side a bit to add a bit more interest, and that just looked a lot better. I tend to use my gut feeling on cropping quite a lot. Now I want to bring out some of the rim light, which is always one of the good fun aspects to this, and also to lay in some texture of the paintbrush. So as you can see, I've got the stiffness laid right down on this, and I would have a separate layer set to multiply, and I'm using the color white. And if you just set that on a layer, it seems as though white in multiply generally doesn't have an effect, but when you're using a thick paintbrush, it does actually show you the paint textures, and I tend to use that later on in the day regarding any painting to add in a bit more painterly effect over the top. I wasn't generally too happy with the textures. I wanted to add in a bit more textures, and this was experimenting away I generally use the sticker spray brush with my texture brushes that I've created over the years, and I overlay them using different blend modes. Typically overlay I like to use, but I do like color dodge sometimes also works, and using the opacity for this just to turn it right down helps quite a lot. It's not going to be too major, the textures, it's just going to be subtle, but it will just add to the interest and the detail to it. There's a bit of experimentation going on here at the moment regarding textures, just to see what works. It's not always apparent what will work initially, but something I throw on may just give me a bit of an idea at times. Here you can see I'm playing around with the red, an extreme saturated red colour or a slightly orange, just to bring out the colour of more like a Spider-Man colour. And now I'm using the airbrush to bring out some of the rim light and the extra colours. I think the time has now come to really start to try and push this to stand out as much as I can do. And again, you can see me toggling on and off the rim light. Not sure if I'm totally happy with that. I think what I want to do is I want to push that a lot more. I think it would work a bit better. With the rim light and using color dodge, I generally do use the airbrush if I possibly can do. Here I am using the fill tool on the texture tab, which is something I don't often use. And I'm playing around with textures here and blend modes, as you can see. I thought I would want some kind of scaly blend mode to be added to add a bit more interest, but only very subtly. And I'm therefore, as you can see on the left hand side, I'm loading in different images and then scaling it in, playing around with the blend modes and just seeing what happens. And eventually you do settle on something that actually looks quite interesting. And again, it just adds an extra level, an extra layer of texture and interest to something. A lot of these textures are pictures that I've taken off my digital camera and just imported in. Basically, I am just opening up from the left-hand menu there below the opacity in the texture fill some images which I have taken. And that one I quite like because it's got some different types of colour on, and that's just made things look a bit more interesting. And it was almost a happy accident to do things like that, and that's what I like about just subtly overlaying textures and playing around with blend modes. All of a sudden, sometimes I accidentally do something and things just look right for some reason. And of course I'll keep it on a separate layer, and it's not a destructive edit, and I can toggle it down and up. The opacity again is a very useful tool in doing this. Bit of cloning here to tidy things up, which is always useful to do. I still wasn't happy with that head, and therefore I laid in some paint and I was playing around with some blend layers just to see what would happen. And I think I used the difference blend layer, and I was quite happy with that. Even though the colour wasn't quite right, I thought the contrast was looking quite good, and therefore maybe I'll just overlay with some colour to bind it together with the rest of the body. But again, that was more of a happy accident again with the blend modes I was playing around with, and then all of a sudden something looks quite good and quite interesting. It's the power of digital art, is that you can really experiment with these things. And as you can see, the contrast is really brought out on the face, and that's where the eye will be drawn to. Just trying to get that right, bit of opacity, and that looks a lot better than it did before now regarding the head. Again, I've still got in mind I really do want to add a red colour to this at some stage. It's just not quite looking unique enough for my liking. It almost looks like a standard Venom type picture. And here we go, I've got the airbrush now. I'm trying to add some red, and this will be in color dodge to really push things. And I'm just knowing that the light's coming from the top right hand corner and just working out where it'll all go. And I can see the idea really coming out now, especially when I flip it back. Yes, that actually looks where I want it to go. and using the palette knife there to bring out the tongue, because I thought the tongue looked a bit boring before. I wanted to add a bit of flourish to it, a bit of excitement almost, and this is where the palette knife can come in very useful. That really has bound it all together now using the colour dodge with the airbrush, and just going through and doing a bit of rendering and adding in some texture again, some brush texture over the top. Now I've got a pretty good idea of what's going on. Just Venom emerging from the gloom. Now I wanted some kind of background, but I wasn't quite sure what I wanted, so I'm just overlaying a few ideas here. A bit of lens flare I thought I would try out, which sometimes works, but unfortunately this lens flare was just not really binding in very well with the overall character. So what I generally do in this situation is that I take over the foreground, I take that layer and I move it to the background and I enlarge it and start moving it around, because I had a bit of an idea that I would want a almost spider insignia that is on his chest and is pronounced in the background somewhere. I have the lighting which would already fit quite nicely, and I thought that it would almost look like a bit of an American flag type idea in the background, which would, because it's almost, I have too much dead space there in the top left hand corner and it just looks a bit dull, and I wanted to fill that with something. And here I am just using transform, and I have that insignia and I'm just trying to place it in a correct position. I think I've realised that the crop isn't quite right, because if I place the flag to fill everything, there's too much dead space, too much space on the right hand side. That looks like a good position for this kind of spider flag, and therefore after that I just use a select tool and cut round it and then crop to selection, which brings it out quite nicely. And actually all of a sudden the painting is almost done. It's all come together. I'm just tidying up now. I'm deleting a few things. There's a little bit of the colour dodge edging out over the main character, and we're erasing that away. And it's not far away from being finished now. That flag in the background, that little trick to set a background up has really worked quite nicely. Now I'm just toggling on and off. It's the final look at things, really. Playing around with bits and bobs. I do have a habit of using the clone tool around this time. And trying out a bit of blur, because sometimes that works to give it more of a photographic feel, but I don't think it's really going to work too well this time. And of course what I wanted to do with, I've got some drip brushes which I created. I wanted to splash a bit of the idea of a bit of blood almost coming from him, and I wanted it roughly around the torso to bring that a bit more out, and it's got to be quite subtle, I think. Just an extra texture over the top to almost again bind it all together and to add that bit of interest. Again, trial and error, changing the opacity, erasing away the bits that don't quite work. Flipping a couple of times, I think I'm almost pretty happy with it. And there we go, that is the finished painting. Had quite a lot of fun with this one, just playing around and seeing what I could get. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.